I'm Melina Tsapos, and this is In-Depth Conversations.
Here at In-Depth Conversations, we talk a lot, and we hope that we might get just a little bit smarter or a little bit wiser, gain some more information from our conversations. But how can we really gain knowledge, and just how do words get their meaning? To help us examine in more depth the philosophical question of rationality and the philosophical problem of induction, our guest for this episode is none other than Peter Gärdenfors. Peter has a background in mathematics and computer science, but you gained your PhD in philosophy. Your dissertation was named Group Decision Theory, and Peter went on to launch a very impressive career with an interest in semantics, concept formation, evolution and cognition, belief revision. He even established a cognitive science department here at Lund University. Peter's publications and books could fill a full library, so I won't go through them all now. But according to Wikipedia, Peter is internationally Sweden's most notable philosopher. He is, safe to say, a man who needs no introduction. So welcome to In-Depth Conversations.
Thank
Peter.
you.
Peter, you have had something that most can't say that they've had, basically almost two careers, or you're a man with two prominent hats. One is in philosophy and the other one is in cognitive science. And this, you've had a very interesting journey, and I hope we can get more into depth on how those two subjects relate. But we should start maybe with a basic question to just understand some of the problems that have been puzzling you or that you've been working with. And so that question is cognition, because it's also in the subject cognitive science, and we hear it a lot, you know, cognition and cognitive this or that. What is cognition for you?
Very briefly, cognitive science is the science of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, traditionally, psychology has been divided into three subfields: cognition, volition, and emotion. So volition is willing and emotion is emotion, yeah. So cognition is this thinking side. And some people have thought that these areas are really independent, but they are not. I mean, they're all interweaved, of course. But cognitive science is a kind of crossroads where you meet researchers from computer science, philosophy, linguistics, psychology, brain sciences, biology. I mean, there are lots of anthropology. There are lots of influences.
And as a philosopher, then, how come you got interested in cognition specifically, or cognitive science? What's the journey there?
You mentioned that I started studying mathematics and programming. And already as a young student, I was interested in AI. That was in the 1970s, very early.
Yeah.
And then I studied philosophy. I was focusing on logic and epistemology. And then I was lucky enough to get this first chair in Sweden in cognitive science. But that was meant for me really coming home, because I've been interested in the interfaces between more formal models, computational models, and philosophical models of knowledge.
So were you invited to, or were you part of founding the Department of Cognitive Science?
I founded it. I mean, I got this research chair, and part of that was part of the task was to build up a PhD education. So we started from the top, and then now we have a master program, but we still don't have any undergraduate program.
Okay. Yeah. Is that a goal? Or?
It would be a goal, except that the faculty is poor and don't have money enough for an undergraduate program.
It's always the resources that are tough. Okay, but very interesting. So you've basically been since the beginning building up the department here and through it all. But your interest, like you said, as a mathematician, as a logician, you became interested in problems in philosophy that related to how we gain knowledge. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so how do you make that connection? How does that make sense? You said you were one of the first to being interested in AI. Nowadays we hear that everywhere, right?
Yeah,
but I can imagine back in the day it was quite a small field. So what was the question there that interested you? And
there were many questions in epistemology, but one that maybe leads up to my main interest was, as a PhD student, I spent 1 year at Princeton, and I had Carl Hempel as a teacher in a course on induction. And in that course, we went through the problems of induction, and I was thinking, how can we solve this? And Hempel was in the really logic analytic tradition. He wanted to only use logical tools to solve the problems of induction. And that turned out to be very difficult.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who don't know what induction is, that sounds even more difficult. But for me, just simply, induction is the problem of induction is how we explain from past observations the future ones. So, for example, the classical example is if all the swans we've observed are white, how do we draw the conclusion that all swans are white?
Yeah, I mean,
basically
induction is the problem. How do you go from single observations to a general scientific law, basically?
Yeah.
And swans are white is not such a big law, but still, I mean, that's how we do. You notice that when you heat the metal, it expands and so on. So we know something about it. So it's in problem of induction, going from single observations to general laws.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think you have a really good point there. That's basic for all science, how we do science, right? So it's a very important fundamental question for knowledge and the things that we know. But so in logic, you can get to, well, when you do deductive logic, I guess you can get to certain truths, but these are just possible truths. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem. And you can have thousands of observations of something, and then suddenly you find a counter instance, and that will destroy the law, basically. So you can never be sure that a number of observations will give you a true law or a valid law.
And then how did Hempel make you think about these things?
I mean, there were these paradoxes. There was Goodman's paradox and there was Hempel's paradox. And Hempel's paradox is the problem that if you want to show that all ravens are black, you can make a number of observations of ravens and all of them are blacks, you have support. But from a logical point of view, all ravens are black is equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. I mean, that's a simple logical fact. And that means that in order to validate all non-black things or non-ravens, you just have to observe a number of non-black things, brown shoes, red herrings, and so on, and notice that they are not ravens. But this sounds very odd. I mean, to say that all non-black things are non-ravens, because non-black and non-raven are very odd concepts. So that's Hempel's paradox. I mean, how do we know what to observe? And the Goodman's paradox also related to what are the properties that we can use in inductions. I mean, raven is a good property, non-raven is not a good property.
Okay, that sounds tricky. And so then what so you were interested in this problem, right? You started digging deeper into it, and maybe we should just get to it, because it's pretty fitting that we're sitting in this room, because you have this idea called conceptual spaces, and this room was actually named in honor of your idea, or of you. So yeah, it's called conceptual spaces. But can you tell us a bit more about this idea? So how did you get? Could you say that that's your solution or your answer to those problems?
That was the beginning of my question here. I mean, I wanted to find a criterion for distinguishing between natural properties from non-natural ones. I mean, ravens from non-ravens. And you couldn't do that in logic, because in logic, every predicate, as it's called, is independent, and the basic predicates are independent. So logic is not enough for that problem. So yeah.
Just so so predicates, and when you say non-natural and natural, do you want to just expand a bit more on that?
I will, because that's the point.
Okay, sorry. All right, go on.
So how can you describe what is a natural property? And then in psychology, people have been very much looking at things are similar. I mean, all ravens are similar. Non-ravens are not similar. I mean, the glass is not similar to a car and so on. I mean, they're all non-ravens. But ravens are united by a lot of similarity. So that was the idea. Natural predicates collect things that are similar. How can we model similarity? And that's when I came to this notion of having a space where you have similarity as distances in the space. And to give you the most basic example, I mean, take how we perceive colors. And you're all familiar with the color circle, I mean, going from red to blue to green to yellow and back again. But we also have the white and black dimension. And that our perception of colors is a three-dimensional space. with one is circular and two dimensions form a circular, and the third one is the white-black dimension. So all black things represent a part of that space, all red things another part of the space. And what I added as kind of key idea is that when you talk about the region of a space, I brought in the mathematical notion of convexity. And convexity means that if you call one thing red and another thing red, then anything in between is also red. I mean, this notion of betweenness is the definition of convexity. And then I said that the key idea is that all natural properties represent convex regions in some space. And then the question is of course, where do the spaces come from? But that was a key idea. Okay. So Raven consists of a region in bird space, and then black is a region of color space. So we in induction concerns the problem of connecting these regions to one another.
And then do you mean quite literally that that's how our cognition functions or works, that we have these regions that are related or connected?
There are lots of methods in psychology for establishing these spaces. So we know the color space, and that's determined by people are judging the similarity of spaces and similarity of colors. And then you use mathematical techniques for generating distances between the colors. And then you end up with this three-dimensional color space. But you can do that for a lot of other things. The vowels we talk can be represented in a space. The tastes we have can be represented in a space. Ordinary space is a space when we used to talk about distances and so on, locations. So there are lots of psychological spaces that have been established. But my hypothesis is that all our thinking is organized in terms of spaces, conceptual spaces.
Yeah, this reminds me a bit, because I remember the first time I was on a lecture and I understood what Kant's idea was about, the time and space, that he was making this distinction between synthetic
and
hyperoriented. That's it. It was a while ago. I need to refresh my Kant. But so this reminds me a bit of that. Did that influence you in a way, how you were thinking about these things, about concepts?
In a sense, my project is a Kantian project. You can call it a neo-Kantian. And Kant tried to find the basic structures of our thinking. And he said we can't help but thinking about the space as ordinary three-dimensional Euclidean space. We can't think about the world without a time dimension. We have causality. He had these what he called Anschauungsformen, I mean the forms of thinking. And my proposal about the conceptual spaces is in the same vein, because I have these structures. They constrain how we think. I mean, you can't think of colors that are not fitting in this three-dimensional space. And
yeah, it's pretty fascinating how I think it's so interesting, because most of us, I don't think, have thought about that. We can't think of color without space, like without being extended. And just to, and I'm sorry if I'm being annoying here, but what is the significance that you've added to with this space? Like that you can, what is it that you can show or talk about with concepts?
No, I mean, this idea that concepts are represented by convex regions has a lot of consequences. I mean, I used it to solve the induction problem, because ravens will turn out to be convex region in space. Non-ravens are more or less impossible to define in terms of that. So if you say that induction only uses natural predicates, then you get around the Hempel and Goodman paradoxes. But then from induction, I turned to a more general investigation of the semantics of natural language. I mean, what do our words mean? How can we talk about what our words mean? And then I started on a program of analyzing different word classes in terms of conceptual spaces.
Fascinating.
So semantics was the next big application of conceptual spaces. Semantics of natural languages.
That's really fascinating, because I think for some of us that have read or try to understand how the philosophy of mind works, or understand the questions in philosophy of mind, we know some concepts like connectionism, for example, is meant to explain how cognition works, or what's that? Symbolism, I think was one of the first ones. And just briefly, so maybe you can explain that better. So symbolism is the classical Turing machine.
Yeah,
right?
that's assuming that everything handled in terms of symbols. I mean, either it's logical symbols or programming symbols. And the early cognitive science was actually building on this idea that the brain is a computer, and thereby the brain is
I think a lot of people still
you still believe it, yeah,
still think of it that way.
but that metaphor didn't really work out.
Why not?
So because there are many problems that cannot be explained by our brains being symbol handler.
Yeah, so it's just not how we do it.
No, well, maybe we do part of our thinking in terms of symbols. I mean, linguistic, but basically very little, in my opinion.
Okay,
And I know lots of people will not like this statement, but anyway.
That's okay.
Then, as an alternative, people developed connectionist models, the neural networks that are at the center of AI nowadays. I mean, the deep networks. But that's on a very low level. You have thousands and billions of neurons that are connected, and they learn very slowly. They learn by being trained on enormous amounts of data, and they learn very slowly. But it turns out that the human brain learns very quickly. I mean, when you learn a new word as a child, you only need one or a couple of examples to get it. A neural network needs thousands of examples to get the meaning of a word. So somehow there is something lacking in the methodology of connectionism, neural networks as we have it now, because the learning processes don't fit with the human learning processes. And that's where I think that the conceptual representation, having this assumption that we think in spaces, we are constrained. I mean, this is the Kantian assumption. We are constrained by this kind of spatial thinking. Yeah? I don't really know how it's represented in the brain, but I have nowadays some ideas. But that constraint will help speed up the learning. Yeah. If you assume that things are organized in spaces, you can learn much quicker.
Yeah, I just want to slow this down so people understand how genius this is, because I think it's so easy to talk about this connectionism, because it is very complex questions and a complex idea. And like we have today, ChatGPT, and people are amazed how quick it can produce all this information. But like you said, I think it can be easy to assume that that's how children learn, or how we learn, that we point at a lamp and you say lamp, and then you have to see like 10 lamps to understand that this is a lamp. But as you say, that's not really how we do it. We quite quickly can understand something from, just hearing it once or seeing it once. You don't have to, we know that there's so many different kinds of dogs, but we still know somehow that they're all dogs. There's something that connects them.
Yeah, they are similar in lots of respects, and that's how we use this notion of similarity to pick out what's common to a dog. And similarity would mean, in my terminology, that they are closely located in some kind of animal space, whatever that looks like.
So how many levels are there of this space? So is there like a general animal space, and then within that space we have other regions like a dog or species, or how does that...
I don't talk about levels. I talk about different domains. So color is one domain, size, temperature, and so on. And if you talk about animals, they are built up in turns by lots of underlying domains. And there are a couple of domains. Of course, animal is a rather high level construction of several other domains. So there is a bit of levels on it, but basically the notion of a domain where you have distances and so on is the central idea.
And so this is really like carving up the world in a way, like how we understand it and how we gain knowledge. But it's also making a connection to the world. So like you said, this constraint is an important factor. But how do we, okay, so maybe I'm just being a bit silly here, but how do we carve it up that way? What does these spaces, or domains, I should say, make them these domains?
That's a very good question, and I don't have a very general answer. I mean, some of the things are given by our sensory mechanisms. So color is given by the way our eyes work, and how the color information is treated by our brains, and we end up with this kind of perception in three-dimensional. And same thing with sizes and shapes and so on. We have the perceptual mechanism, and most of the examples I've been giving are for perceptual domains, because there we know something about the psychology. But if you go to more abstract domains, like what is an animal, I mean, how can we describe animal space? It's not so easy. There are psychological methods and computational methods for doing it, but it's a lot of work to find the structure of these more abstract space. And if you go to really abstract things democracy or justice and so on, those things that philosophers, we have no idea how the structure of our thinking space looks like. Yeah.
Wow.
So it's a kind of research program. I start from the perceptual level, and then I hope that we can build up to more abstract and more general concepts.
Okay. And how does, because you mentioned emotions also, was one of these undercategories, but how does emotion play into it? Do you fit in emotions?
There are theories of emotion space, and the basic theory says there are two dimensions. One is positive, negative, and the positive emotion is negative. And the other dimension is arousal. You're calm or excited, and that's two dimensions basically forms a circle. You can identify different emotions. That's one simple model of emotion. Some people say we need three dimensions, but basically we can talk about emotions being similar and less similar, and we can present them in. There are theories about emotion space. We don't know if it's a true theory, correct theory. Yeah.
But do these work together with your semantic theories, for example, or your concepts of semantics, how that works, and conceptual spaces? Do they map together somehow? Because it seems to me that a lot of the conclusions we get to, or how we understand the world, depends also on, for example, emotions. And
yeah, of course. I mean, emotions. I mean, we don't normally talk about emotions in our scientific laws and so on. But for everyday life, we need it. I mean, some things taste good and some things taste bad. We approach and avoid, or some people are likable, some people are not likable. We need to know what is the emotional reactions to different category of things.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So that's kind of like two sides, or you need both of these kind of. That's super fascinating. And where do you hope? So, you already mentioned a bit of this, but so you hope that this could build up to more general theories?
It's a research program, yes, and I'm relying on psychology. I mean, lots of psychology to identify these. But nowadays there are also computational methods to generate the spaces, and so that connects back to my old interest in AI. I mean, how can we use AI to identify the similarities between objects and use that in order to derive better models of the semantics of natural language?
So you're thinking more of it as a tool to understand us better rather than understanding us better by studying AI?
Both ways. I mean, I'm hoping that if we understand how human semantics works, how we give the words meaning, then hopefully this understanding can be turned into computer implementations. I really want somebody to implement the conceptual spaces in computers, not via neural networks directly, but maybe a combination of neural networks with some constraints. And to describe these constraints, I have to work much more.
A lot more work to be done. But so you think that once we could do that, or once we do that, AI would have meaning as well? Is that the missing link? Because would you say AI has meaning now?
No. I mean, it's people say that ChatGPT understands what you write. That it doesn't. It's still only statistics, and it's quite easy to give examples that ChatGPT doesn't understand what's written. So in order to give meaning to words, we need more. But it's not enough with having these spaces. You also need what's called the grounding of words. I mean, symbol grounding is an old term here. You need to ground the meaning of words in the real world. And lots of our meanings is dependent, in particular, when we talk about actions and so on, is dependent on how we interact with the world. In cognitive science, this is called embodied or situated cognition. I mean, we're not only the brain is not an isolated thinking machine. It's interacting with the body and with the world. And ChatGPT needs to be interacting with ChatGPT only exists on screens nowadays, but it needs to be interacting with the world and learn about physical mechanisms and so on in order to be have real meanings to words.
But there's still an idea that it's the program that determines how an AI would have meaning. So if you could have a robot, like we have Epi here, our robot is called Epi, and if you would just implement these AI programs, would then Epi have meaning?
No, Epi needs to be able to interact with the world. I mean, you can take a simple insect, like an ant or a cockroach, they have very simple brains, but they interact with very simple heuristics in the world. They have mechanisms. That is a small signal from the world. There is a wind coming, and then the cockroach thinks there is something approaching, and it hides under something.
But that's well. Let me ask you this. So, would you still believe that it's substrate independent? So it doesn't matter what the material is made out of. It's the actual programming, or like using the conceptual spaces and all these that matter, rather than maybe being biological, for example.
I don't know.
What's your hunch?
So far, biology is much more adapted to the world than any robot you have. I'm not saying that we never have a robot that is embodied and connected to the world, but it takes a lot. I mean, the robot really, I mean, we call the robot epi because it's dealing with epigenetics, that is how children develop their thinking. And I think that a robot that really will be able to interact with the world will have to develop its interaction as a child does, stock things on top of each other in order to see how they fall down and hit their heads on the table and whatnot, in order to understand how the physics of the world.
Yeah.
So nowadays, robots don't understand physics.
That's true. But maybe one day, is that what you're saying?
I don't know.
Fascinating. But it's also so interesting for me anyway, because one of my favorite subjects is philosophy of mind, and just to think of ourselves and try to understand how our thinking works. And to hear your career, that you've really been working and thinking so much about these questions, do you feel like you've gotten closer to knowing more, like the truth, or has more questions popped up along the way? Is there more, how does it feel?
Truth is a word I try to avoid.
Okay, yeah.
I think that's a very overrated in philosophy. But I mean, I'm more or less a pragmatist. I think we need to solve practical problems and how we interact with the world and so on. Yes, I think I've learned a lot. I mean, yes, I've learned a lot, and I think I've hopefully contributed a little bit to understanding of how we give words meaning, how the mechanisms work and so on. Then if and how this can be implemented in computers, robots, is still an open question.
I think, Peter, we can go on talking about so many other things as well, and to keep talking about this subject, because it's just absolutely fascinating. But one thing, I admire many things about you, of course, but maybe one of the things that I admire most about you is, even though you've had this success and long career, you still seem so joyful and excited about talking about your work and the subject and questions. Do you have any advice for us other mortals? Just how do you keep this interest alive and keep being fascinated with what you do?
Once at a conference, I was given a T-shirt where it says "Be curious" on the chest, and I think that's what I've always been. I mean, since I never came to the university to have a career. I came to the university because I wanted to learn. I was curious, and I'm still very curious.
But that's what I mean. This balance between that. That's I love that you say that. But the fact that you say that you've also learned a lot, but you're still open that there is more to learn. So you don't
of course,
stop there and become like, okay, now I know everything. You still keep curious. That balance, figuring that out, I think is very admirable, and your inspiration in that way. All right, Peter, this conversation has, I think, been enlightening in a lot of ways, and just having the opportunity to dig more about how you think about things and solve some problems in philosophy. But I'm sure that people want to know more, but you have a lot of really great books on the subject, and you also have a really great paper coming out. Maybe I can link it once it's published, summarizing, or it's a good overview at least of conceptual spaces. And then you'll have to come back so we can continue on all the other interesting subjects that you've written about. Thank you so much, Peter.
Thank you.